1. America. Before America, before 1492. Long before 1492, long before Columbus or Europe even knew this land existed, North America was already home to millions of people. Archaeological and historical evidence shows indigenous civilizations thriving as early as 10,000 BCE and clearly organized societies by 1000 CE. Nations like the Mississippian culture were building large cities such as Cahokia around 1050 CE, with trade networks stretching thousands of kilometers. By the time Europeans arrived in the late 15th century, indigenous peoples had systems of governance, agriculture, and commerce. Corn, beans, and squash were already being cultivated for centuries. Trade routes connected the Great Lakes, the Southwest, and the Gulf of Mexico. The key difference was how land was understood. Indigenous societies treated land as communal and spiritual, not as private property to be bought and sold. When Europeans arrived after 1492, they used that difference to justify taking it. If land wasn't fenced or titled, they claimed it was unused. That idea would later become the legal and moral foundation for the takeover of an entire continent. 2. Discovery, invasion, and first seizures, 1492–1600s. In 1492, Columbus reached the Caribbean, marking the beginning of European invasion, not discovery. Within decades, Spanish expeditions moved through the Americas, followed later by the English and French in the 1500s and early 1600s. What followed was catastrophic. Between 1492 and 1600, indigenous populations declined by up to 90%, largely due to disease. Smallpox outbreaks were recorded as early as 1518, spreading faster than settlers themselves. Entire communities disappeared before Europeans even arrived physically. But violence followed close behind. Armed conquest, forced labour systems, and coerced treaties became common. By the late 1500s, Europeans had learned a simple strategy: weaken indigenous societies, claim land, and build settlements on top of it. These early seizures created the first ports, farms, and trade hubs. Indigenous economies were dismantled and replaced with systems designed to serve European empires. This phase didn't create wealth yet. It created space that would later be turned into profit. 3. Colonies built on dispossession, 1600s, 1700s. Beginning in 1607 with Jamestown and 1620 with Plymouth, British colonies expanded rapidly along the east coast. Expansion wasn't peaceful. Throughout the 1600s, colonial militias fought repeated wars against indigenous nations, including the Pequot War, 1636–1638, and King Philip's War, 1675–1678. Each conflict ended the same way: more land taken. By the early 1700s, native nations had been pushed inland, while colonists controlled fertile coastal regions. This land became the economic base of the colonies. Tobacco exports surged in the 1600s, followed by cotton and timber in the 1700s. By 1750, colonial wealth was directly tied to land ownership. Indigenous people were excluded from this growing economy, while their former land generated profit for settlers and merchants. When the American Revolution approached in the 1770s, the colonies were already economically strong. That strength didn't come from independence, it came from a century of dispossession that made land cheap and wealth concentrated. 4. Independence without freedom for all, 1776–1800s. In 1776, the United States declared independence from Britain, promising liberty and self-rule. But for indigenous nations, independence marked a new and more aggressive phase of expansion. Between 1783 and 1800, the U.S. signed dozens of treaties with native nations, many of which were broken almost immediately. In 1823, the Supreme Court ruled in Johnson v. McIntosh that indigenous people did not fully own their land. This decision, based on earlier doctrines, allowed the federal government to control land sales and seizures. It legalized dispossession. Economically, the U.S. government sold seized land cheaply to settlers throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s, funding expansion and population growth. Indigenous removal wasn't accidental, it was policy. Independence gave the U.S. full control over westward expansion, turning land into revenue and power. Freedom applied selectively, and indigenous nations paid the price. 5. Manifest destiny and industrial power, 1800s. By the 1830s, expansion had become official ideology. Manifest destiny claimed Americans were meant to rule from coast to coast. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed, leading to forced marches like the Trail of Tears between 1838 and 1839, where thousands died. Once land was cleared, industry followed. Railroads expanded rapidly after 1860, cutting through native land. The discovery of gold in 1848 in California and later resources across the West fueled industrial growth. By 1890, the U.S. Census declared the frontier closed. Rail companies received millions of acres through federal land grants in the mid to late 1800s. Indigenous people were confined to reservations, often on poor land. This era transformed stolen territory into factories, rail networks, and financial institutions. By the end of the 19th century, the US had become an industrial power, because it had space, resources, and land at minimal cost. 6. Wars, corporations, and global reach, 1900–1945. By 1900, indigenous resistance had been crushed, and land was fully integrated into the US economy. Natural resources powered factories, and corporations expanded rapidly. During World War I, 1914–1918, the US became a major supplier of goods and loans. World War II, 1939–1945, changed everything. While Europe and Asia were devastated, the US mainland remained untouched. By 1945, the US produced over half of the world's industrial output and held the majority of global gold reserves. This dominance wasn't sudden. It was built over centuries of land control, industrial growth, and capital accumulation. Indigenous land had become military bases, factories, and transport hubs. By the end of the war, the US wasn't just powerful. It was central to the global economy. 7. Dollar power and world control, 1945–1990s. In 1944, even before World War II ended, the Bretton Woods Conference established a new global financial system centered on the US dollar. By 1945, institutions like the IMF and World Bank were operational, giving the US enormous influence over global finance. Throughout the Cold War, 1947–1991, the US expanded military bases worldwide while corporations spread across continents. Control shifted from land to finance. Debt, trade rules, and currency dominance replaced direct conquest. By the 1970s, the dollar became fully dominant in global trade. Nations didn't need to be invaded. They could be pressured economically. The wealth that enabled this system traced back to earlier expansion. Indigenous nations, meanwhile, remained marginalized inside the very structure built on their land. 8. The United States in 2025, legacy and power. By 2025, the United States remains a global power, economically and militarily. Its influence comes through technology, finance, and military reach rather than frontier expansion. But the foundation hasn't changed. Indigenous communities continue to face broken treaties and land disputes, many dating back to the 1800s. Wealth concentration and corporate dominance reflect patterns established centuries earlier. Control of land became control of resources. Control of resources became control of systems. Understanding how the US became powerful means following the timeline honestly, from pre-1492 indigenous societies to modern global dominance. The rise of the United States was not accidental. It was built step by step, year by year, on expansion, dispossession, and control. That legacy still shapes the world today.